America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we've got quite a lineup today of not only guests, but various topics that we will address. First hour, I want to spend some time, first of all, talking about two different editorials, one from the Wall Street Journal, one from National Review, which I think are very significant because oftentimes the editorial pages of various outlets, news outlets and magazines and newspapers and things like that tend to leave the really controversial issues sometimes to the opinion writers. But I think in both cases, you can see that they felt the real need to, in the case of the Wall Street Journal, talk about the Democratic Protectorate of Illinois, and the one from National Review, ICE is no Gestapo, which will be a good lead-in to a couple of conversations, because at the bottom of the hour, we'll be talking with Heather McDonald, author of many books, including one that we'll feature because it relates to many of these issues about DEI and ICE and the rest, and that is when race trumps merit. So we'll spend some time talking with her about a number of different related topics that she has addressed over these many years. And then next hour, we have Colonel Allen West with us. I'm sure he'll have something to say about some of the individuals that have left the state of Texas for Illinois and other places, but also has put together something where they are calling upon individuals who serve mostly in politics, although he certainly, as an individual, served in the military. You take an oath of office, whether it's in the military, whether it's a government official, and people that have been breaking their oaths, and we'll be talking about that. He also has some comments about rules of engagement for ICE. And if that's not enough, that last half hour will be on the subject of socialism. Very good piece that came out by Jerry Newcomb, the siren song of socialism. And then John Stossel, my socialist mayor. And I thought maybe that's a little premature until I looked at some of the polls. And it is quite likely that a socialist, a Marxist, a Muslim Marxist, by the way, will be the next mayor in New York City. So we will have quite a bit to cover today. If by chance we don't get to that, I've already put together all the articles we'll be talking about tomorrow with Dr. Merrill Matthews and Liberty McCarter. And so I think you want to really be listening in as we cover many of these issues. But the editors of the Wall Street Journal have until now kind of sat on the sidelines but said, okay, it's time to say something, and that is they remind us that Texas Democrats have fled Illinois to escape having to vote on this issue of congressional district maps, and they said the destination is amusing to them since no one knows more about partisan gerrymanders than Illinois Democrats. And we're going to give you two examples. Our listeners in Illinois already know this, but again, we broadcast in 40-plus states, and some of you will be surprised. But let's give you the numbers first before we give you the geography. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and his allies purport to be outraged by the new Texas map, which could yield a GOP 3 to 5 new House seats. And again, you have to run for them. Doesn't necessarily mean because they are fair to a potential Republican nominee doesn't mean that he or she will win. But nevertheless, they said J.B. does know how it's done. Illinois has 17 House seats, and 14 of them are held by Democrats. I'll talk about those three and how that is the case. And so thanks to, they said, successful and successive map drawing by Democrats with no Republican kind of check background or anything like that, the state's districts are among the most gerrymandered in the country. There's at least one group, and I didn't even know there was a group studying gerrymandering. This one's at Princeton University, which gave the award, if you see this as an award, of Illinois being the worst gerrymandered state in the country. Just think about the fact that Donald Trump wasn't really even contested in the state of Illinois, but he still won 43% of the vote, and you wouldn't know that by looking at the congressional districts. So again, They have a diagram there. I held it up yesterday. If you go to the website, pointofview.net, you can see the diagram there of the state of Illinois, and we'll talk about a couple of those because they said this nearby map offers a sense of artistry required to pull off this gerrymander. Democrats packed Republicans into 3 largely rural and exurban safe seats. That'd be the 12th, 15th, and 16th. And then 3 Democratic districts are worth noting. Just in the interest of time, I'll look at 2. One of those we mentioned yesterday. It's the 13th Congressional District, which begins in East St. Louis, runs all the way north to the state capital of Illinois, Springfield, and then they say in parentheses, think government workers. So you're going to pick up a lot of Democrats there. And then now it shoots to the east all the way to the college town of Champaign, Illinois, to pick up hopefully enough Democrats so that this would indeed be a Democrat-safe district. And it is, but it used to be one that was somewhat competitive, and actually, if I remember from our history, was at one time actually a Republican district. The 17th one he talks about is a little different. This one meanders around to include Rockford, Illinois, to the north, Moline and Rock Island, and then in the Quad Cities over there by the Iowa border, and then makes it all the way down to Peoria. And again, I'm not telling anything that some of you who are listeners in the state of Illinois know, but this is, I think, eye-opening for many people in other parts of the country. As a matter of fact, one of the articles I've posted for tomorrow, which I'd love to get some comments from Merrill Matthews as well as Liberty McCarter, is the fact that there are so many Democrats, and it gives, matter of fact, as Noah Rothman writes about this, illustrations from California, Illinois, New York, and all the rest, where people are just outraged that gerrymandering is taking place in the state of Texas. It reminds me of one of those famous scenes in Casablanca, outrage that gambling is taking place in that establishment. And again, it just is a good illustration of the fact that when you have right now Governor J.B. Pritzker arguing, well, if you're going to do this, we'll gerrymander. And they're saying, how can you gerrymander already gerrymandered seats? It's hard to think of how you could exclude, but I guess it's always a possibility because, as they point out, that if you really worked hard, maybe you could figure out a way to eliminate all 3 Republican seats, because after all, if you look at the state of Massachusetts, they have 9 House Democrats and no Republicans. Of course, it was just one of many states we listed yesterday, but if nothing else, the argument is that J.B. Pritzker is saber-rattling that if Texas moves ahead with its new map, then Illinois might redraw its map to eliminate those 3 remaining Republican districts, which, again, we've seen in many states where that indeed has taken place. But I, again, love the editors of the Wall Street Journal that end by saying, but please spare us the sanctimony that Texas gerrymandering is a unique threat to Democratic competition. The sad reality is, and I don't endorse it on either side, but the reality is Republicans maybe have been a little bit slow to do the kind of gerrymandering that has taken place in places like many of these blue states, California, Illinois, New York, but also Connecticut, Massachusetts, almost all of the Northeast, and many other places. Are there places, as we have heard, where there are all Republicans? Yes. Are some of those gerrymandered? Yes, they are. But in some respects, the outrage right now for what's happening in Texas only is happening because people want to turn a blind eye to what's been happening in many other of these blue states. Let's take a break, though. We want to get to another editorial opinion. That one comes from National Review. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A recent poll by the Pew Research Center discovered that 27% of Americans view evangelicals as the most unfavorable faith. They also discovered that Jews ranked as the most favorable religious group. Now, the poll asked Americans to rank 6 of the mainstream religious groups. Those were Jews, mainline Protestants, Catholics, Muslims, Mormons, and evangelical Christians. the greatest number of unfavorable feelings were expressed towards evangelical Christians and Mormons. By contrast, the most positive feelings were reserved for Jews at 35%. In fact, only 6% said they had a negative view of them. Catholics came in at second at 34%, saying they viewed them favorably, and only 18% said they had a negative impression of them. I would contend that the poll not only tells us something about the people's attitudes towards various religious groups, but it also reminds us of the nature of those groups. On my radio program, I mentioned that a majority of Supreme Court justices are Catholic, as are a sizable number of members of Congress. Then I asked, what does that tell you about their politics? Of course, the answer is it doesn't tell you anything, because some take their Catholic faith seriously, while others do not. You could do the same by providing a list of prominent Jewish people. The religious groups with the highest favorability, Jews and Catholics, also have the greatest theological diversity. Often the religious label says less about their faith and more about their family background. The groups with the highest unfavorability, Mormons and evangelical Christians, have the greatest theological cohesion. Put another way, many Americans have no problem with religion unless the religious people take his or her faith very seriously. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, bottom of the hour, we'll be talking with Heather McDonald. Top of the next hour, we'll be talking with Colonel Alan West, and then we'll focus on some issues related to socialism, because that has become a very significant drumbeat on college campuses and in the culture at large. But one of the articles that I thought would also be helpful to you is by the editors of National Review, and it has the rather arresting title, ICE is no Gestapo. Just to give you a little bit of history, they say in the summer of 1934, the Gestapo carried out a murderous purge against Chancellor Adolf Hitler's internal party enemies, and that was known as the Night of the Long Knives. In the summer of 2025, Immigration and Customs Enforcement detained illegal immigrants and ensured they weren't evading lawful immigration proceedings. Can you spot the difference, they ask? Apparently, Democrats cannot, they say. And again, when you have one person after another, one political leader after another, referring to what is happening in the streets on the issue of immigration, from ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that is compared to Gestapo, you can see why we have the problem. As a matter of fact, one of the things we'll be talking about in just a few minutes with Heather McDonald is a piece that she wrote a while back, which had the very interesting question, is rioting acceptable? Because she talks about the fact that there has been so much justification for some of the action, and she reported a few stories that came out of Los Angeles that were never reported by the mainstream media. Of course, we do have one that's just down the road from us, which did take place, and that one was in Alvarado, Texas, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But lest you forget how many times ICE agents have been referred to as Gestapo. Let me at least quote two people. One of those would be Tim Walz. You remember him, right? Of course. And he said that Donald Trump's modern-day Gestapo is scooping folks off the streets. That's what, again, the governor of Minnesota, the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, said at a May commencement address. The modern-day Gestapo is scooping people up, but he's not alone. Congressman Stephen Lynch, who's from the state of Massachusetts, said when you compare the old films of the Gestapo grabbing people off the streets of Poland and you compare them to the nondescript thugs who grabbed that graduate student, it looks like a Gestapo operation. Then you can read this because it gives you Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, Dan Goldman, Rachel Maddow. You get the idea. We don't even need to go into all of that. And the concern is legitimate. When you refer to your opponents as Nazis, when you compare the President of the United States to Hitler, when you say that anybody that is actually in uniform with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that they are evil individuals kidnapping people and the rest, you can, I think, in your mind's eye, justify taking some pretty rash action. And that's why the editors put it this way. This inflamed rhetoric is firmly in the American tradition. It's also totally cracked and part of a atmosphere around ICE operations, because they go on to say that some anti-ICE activists have been taking matters into their own hands. 11 left-wing agitators ambushed an ICE facility in Alvarado, Texas, opening fire on agents and shooting one of them in the neck. When you look at the number of times the weapons were fired, the only thing that protected life was the fact that they were really terrible shot. But nevertheless, in another set of circumstances, you could have had a lot of dead bodies right there in Alvarado, Texas. Oh, but it isn't just in Texas. Of course, in Portland, Oregon, you have an incendiary device that was thrown at officers. You also, in the state of Texas, down in McAllen, Texas, which is near the border, an individual police officer was shot, and also two other Border Patrol agents were actually hurt as well. And so they make the very obvious claim that these attackers have evidently taken the idea that ICE is American Gestapo all too seriously. They go on to remind us that ICE agents are simply doing their job, which is a function of the legitimate power of the federal government to regulate immigration and to expel those with no legal right to live or work in this country. I think it would also be helpful to point out that although there perhaps are some that do not have a criminal record, the last numbers I've looked at were more than 2/3 of the people that have been taken by ICE have very substantial criminal records. So it isn't just that they, quote, broke the law, because now people want to minimize that by crossing the border. Cross the border illegally into some countries and find out what happens to you. But nevertheless, most of the individuals being taken right now have rap sheets that would cause you to celebrate that they are being taken off of the street. But that is the case. And the argument that sometimes they wear masks, ICE officers only take such steps to protect their identity because they're facing violent resistance. And so you have ICE enforcing the laws that are on the books, which say that illegal immigrants shall be detained until their immigration procedures reach a conclusion. And if anything, these proceedings tend to provide overly generous due process for illegal immigrants. So then they say, well, okay, if you've got a problem with that, is there a solution? Well, yes, there is. They say if Democrats don't like immigration laws, they can run campaigns to change them. But here is something that, again, you don't hear very often. Again, I will hold up our book on immigration, a biblical point of view on immigration. Not too long ago, They remind us Democrats wanted to expand the ICE agency, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and none other than Tim Walz. We just mentioned him a minute ago. Governor Tim Walz actually supported what was called the Lankford Bill in the Biden administration that would have brought about a threefold increase in ICE's annual budget. Much of that now accomplished in the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. And interestingly enough, all but 5 Democrats in the Senate supported it as well. So you had an overwhelming number of Democrats that not so long ago were quite willing to increase dramatically the funding for ICE. Well, again, they then make the obligatory comment at the end. There are, they say, questions about the legality and wisdom of some of Trump's immigration actions, especially the deportation of the alleged MS-13 members to an El Salvador prison earlier this year. But in the big picture, though, what we've seen at the border and in ICE enforcement actions is an administration that finally is taking our immigration laws seriously. The Democrats view this as insipid Nazism is another indication of their opposition to immigration enforcement as such, and an indictment to them, not the ICE agents doing their duty. Very good piece, which again has the title, ICE is no Gestapo. Come back, we will spend a little bit of time after we get into a couple of issues about DEI to talk about ICE, that is ICE, and some of the reporting that Heather McDonald has done even from Los Angeles. But we will be talking about her book on When Race Trumps Merit. That gets us into the issue of DEI and a battle that was taking place just down the road just a few days ago, and dealing with the issue of whether or not the DEI departments that existed at Fort Worth would continue or whether they would be shut down, as has been asked and required of the administration itself. So let's take a break. We'll spend some time talking with her, and then later we'll talk with Colonel Alan West. But let me just, as I mentioned before, say that we encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. First of all, you can find both of these articles and many others we're going to be quoting from as well. And if you've really been blessed by some of the kinds of things we talk about here on Point of View, let me see if I can encourage you to pay it forward. We oftentimes hear of the impact that this program has had on the lives of individuals. We get comments, we get phone calls, we get letters, and all the rest. And they certainly appreciate the kind of news, information, and commentary we provide, the guests that we provide, and the way in which we attempt to document the things that we say. And so if you have benefited from that, as you've heard us say before, most individuals who listen to this program have never supported it, and yet I think you know that we are listener-supported. So at the moment, we have what's called the $10 campaign. If you go to the website, you will see that we have a $10 bill there. You can see Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill. Says give $10 today. And if you've never given, I would encourage some of you to maybe chip in $10 just as a way to say thank you for what you're doing on Point of View. Let's take a break. We'll talk with Heather McDonald right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's, if we can, for just a few minutes before we talk with Heather McDonald, talk about a couple of other issues that you might want to know about. And that is, as we've been talking about how there is this name calling, whether it's referring to ICE as Gestapo or the president as Hitler or Republicans as Nazis, it actually filters down to just the day-to-day people. And a good illustration of that happens in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Municipal Police Training Committee is responsible for training more than 20,000 police officers there in the Bay State. Unfortunately, as some people have pointed out, what they're teaching the police officers is totally incorrect. As a matter of fact, it is actually, I think, libelous, but we'll leave it to you to decide that, because it turns out that the Massachusetts Municipal Police Training Committee has actually labeled Moms for Liberty as a hate group. Now, again, I am well aware of the fact that some of the individuals that we interview, some of the organizations that we've talked about are labeled as hate groups, but that's a stretch. Moms for Liberty is a hate group, but according to the committee, Moms for Liberty uses parents' rights as a vehicle to attack public education and make schools less welcoming for minority and LGBTQ students. Okay, where's the proof for that? Well, you know where I'm going with this. If you've been listening to Point of View any length of time, that comes from the Southern Poverty Law Center. That is, of course, a group that has been many times labeling groups as hate groups that don't even deserve that. And it's amazing that it will, of course, pick out some groups that really are anti-Semitic or they're white supremacist or whatever, and they lump into it all sorts of conservative organizations and Christian ministries. And you've heard us talk about whether it's American Family Association, whether it's a Family Research Council. More recently, Focus on the Family made that list. And so not surprising. But nevertheless, let's at least give some perspective on that. And that is Moms for Liberty are not attacking public education. If anything, what they're doing is going to, in some cases, school board meetings and raising really good questions about whether or not the kinds of books that are available to the students, or in many cases, the kinds of books that are actually read to the students, are age appropriate. You've heard us talk about this with Kelly Shackelford. They've got some cases out of California, First Liberty Institute. We've had, and matter of fact, next week we'll have Lathan Watson here talking about some other cases they've been dealing with as well. And of course, this is, if anything, a deliberate attempt to try to improve public education, to focus on the most appropriate things that should be taught in the public schools, and to get rid of some of the indoctrination, some of the pro-homosexual ideology, and all the rest. And so, if anything, there seems to be this assumption running through this right now that if you are going to be expressing your concern at a public school meeting, at a school board meeting, or whatever it might be, that is a sense in which supposedly that you're attacking public education and making it less welcoming for LGBTQ students. So I just thought we would illustrate that particular point because it is a significant one indeed. And while we were talking about this idea of is ICE Gestapo, one of the articles that I wrote a while back was really based on a Heather McDonald column. Her column that appeared in the Wall Street Journal was, "Is Rioting Acceptable?" And she really focused our attention on a couple of events that took place in Los Angeles. Now, she's with the Manhattan Institute in New York City, but she was out there looking at what was happening because you might remember she in the past has written a book called The War on Cops, and she's been looking at this issue, I suspect, suspect there's a book coming out on the issue of ICE and immigration. But nevertheless, she, first of all, was just amazed at how the media was doing a very, I think it'd be fair to say, very poor, inadequate, maybe even ineffective way of covering some of this, because she talks about how, for example, a crowd broke into an ICE facility, an Immigration and Customs Enforcement Detention Center, and that was a goal to, quote, liberate the detainees. The vandals were able to overpower the group at the time, which were National Guard soldiers, using everything from improvised bombs made from M80 firecrackers, nails, and broken glass, and then tells the story of another situation in which 2 ICE agents actually had pulled an individual off the street, and now a mob surrounded the 2 ICE agents. These about a dozen men dumped out of a truck, grabbed the handcuffs suspect from the back of the ICE van, threw him into their truck and fled. And, the ICE agents tried to give chase, but without sirens or lights, the pursuit was futile. And again, as she points out in the piece, and so you can read my piece July 9th, 2025, or of course you can even find the link, and she points out that neither of these 2 incidents were reported by the media. Instead, what we had during that period of time was that these protests were largely peaceful, and we've heard that phrase before and know how individually accurate it was. And she even points out there was a federal judge that acknowledged that there were an occasional stray violent incident, but nothing of the sort. And so that's why she's kind of raised this issue: is rioting acceptable? How much is it? Because to use an old phrase that we've used before from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, defining deviancy down, our society oftentimes tends to minimize bad behavior. And so we have seen individuals oftentimes make excuses for some of the things that are happening in our culture. And so as a result, you could use the phrase defining deviancy down, or if you want to use a Bible verse, again, I oftentimes equate some of the comments by Daniel Patrick Moynihan to Isaiah 5, verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. And so when we talk about this idea of ICE, whether or not it's a Gestapo, when we come back at the top of the hour, we'll be talking with our friend Colonel Alan West, and he suggested that if we're going to see, as we have, for example, in Alvarado, Texas, what essentially is a political, even like a military ambush, we need to then begin to talk about what are the rules of engagement. I mean, here's an individual who has served 22 years in the Army, then, of course, has served in Congress and the 22nd District there in Florida. But he's begun to say, wait a minute, if we're going to be dealing with this level of violent attack, we need to start equipping ICE agents the way we would equip people in the military. Isn't it sad that we even have to talk about it that way? But I think it's a good illustration of that. Again, 11 of these agitators ambushed an ICE facility in Alvarado, Texas, opened fire. As a matter of fact, at one point, they even set off some firecrackers and things like that to try to draw them out so they could actually shoot them. If you go into all the detail, pretty amazing as well. And, of course, I mentioned what was happening in McAllen, Texas, but let's again go to other parts of the country. I mentioned in Portland, Oregon, an incendiary device thrown at the officers. How about one in Washington State where a rider threw a rock into and then set fire to an ICE building in Washington, D.C.? Of course, there's been a real national movement to unmask ICE agents, to dox them, and encourage people to harass them on the streets, but also in their homes. And according to the latest figures from the Department of Homeland Security, ICE agents are now facing about a 700% surge in assaults. So we're talking about some things that are pretty significant. Even though we haven't been able to connect up with Heather McDonald, certainly I know we'll be able to connect up with Alan Watts. Island West, I should say, and get into some of his issues there as well, because that is of great concern. So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple other topics that are related to much of this issue of wokeness and DEI, which, by the way, reminds me of a booklet I also would love to be making available to you. This one came out actually 3 years ago, so it's time for an update, because it is entitled A Biblical Point of View on Wokeness. Back 3 years ago, a lot of people said, I don't even know what that word means. So we spent some time defining it. We gave you some illustrations of how it was unfolding and even happening in some of the major institutions in the country. But again, these are resources we give to you in case you find yourself saying, I'd like to get just kind of a basic understanding, and I'd like to be able to read it in 10 minutes. That's what we have, and we'd be glad to make it available to you. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, for just a few minutes, mention the fact that we were hoping to have Heather McDonald. Her book is entitled Race Trumps Merit, When Race Trumps Merit, How the Pursuit of Equity Sacrifices Excellence, Destroys Beauty, and Threatens Lives. And I thought it was very appropriate in light of what has been happening over the last couple of days. Just down the road from us, I know we broadcast all over the country, but let me use an example right here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Fort Worth had to to consider whether or not to actually dismantle their DEI programs. And that is something that Heather McDonald talks about in her book. It, of course, is something that Christopher Rufo has talked about in his books, and Vivek Ramaswamy has talked about as well. And so those have been some really important issues. And interestingly enough, when you talked about the city council, you would think that that decision would be pretty simple, because as the mayor, Maddie Parker, pointed out, if you did not dismantle the DEI programs there in Fort Worth, it would cost the city $277 million. As a matter of fact, it would cost more than that because some of those grants had already been given, so they'd have to actually return the funds or pay them back. And so in some respects, it was just a good illustration that this would have probably been a pretty easy decision. And unfortunately, it isn't a decision that came quite easily at all. And so we may talk about that later, because if nothing else, you are hearing all sorts of people making the case that sort of the implication that is we shouldn't go along with the Trump administration. They're a bunch of fascists. If we lose any kind of DEI department, we're going to go back to, I don't know, Jim Crow or slavery or segregation, something like that. And just the weeping and gnashing of teeth, the finger pointing, the criticism, and then just a complete oblivious to the fact that you would lose $277 million of federal grants, and the people that, if they stayed in those offices, might be prosecuted by the Justice Department, which would not be fair to them. And it just like it was water off a duck's back. Nobody seemed to even care. And they were going to fight tooth and nail all the way to the very end to prevent doing what they eventually had to do. And this went on till 11:30 at night. And I just think it illustrates again that though yesterday we were talking about some of the material that we read from Stanley Kurtz and from Victor Davis Hanson, in some respects we're seeing some remarkable changes. And these are brought about because of President Donald Trump, as well as people in his administration, especially some in the Department of Education, but also in the Civil Rights Division and Justice Department. Nevertheless, there are people that are going to fight to prevent any kind of change. The assumption was made that once we get these DEI programs into the schools, we get them into the universities, we get them into the various businesses, we get them into state and local government, nobody would ever dare take them out. And so it was just a good illustration of that as well. If you're not familiar with the book by Heather McDonald, let me just point out that she has raised some really significant concerns. When you think about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or the issue of critical race theory and critical theory, you tend to think that those show up pretty much in the social sciences, and they do. But I have written commentaries in the past based on her book, which has been out for now 2 years, pointing out that now it's even showing up in the STEM courses, math and science and things of that nature. And so there were individuals, especially under the Biden administration, that actually wanted to do what they could to implement some of those ideas. And as a result, wanted to make sure that they could try to fund, I love this is a direct quote, student researchers who were or had been homeless, or were or had been in foster care, or maybe were eligible for free school lunch programs. And when you hear that, you go, okay, I really want to help people that are marginalized. But what this is doing is ultimately under the guise of trying to combat bias in the STEM particular areas. And lest you say, well, I'm not going into science, do you have a doctor? And that was the other thing that she's been talking about as well. There was this nonprofit group called Do No Harm, and it began to look at what was the application process in many of the medical schools, and concluded that the various issues were used to try to advance individuals who maybe didn't have merit, but because of race, gender, sexual orientation, would be given a hand up and even a hand out in that regard. And interestingly enough, for example, how have you committed yourself to understanding and aiding in the pursuit of equity and inclusion in your academic, professional, and personal life? They ask applicants, for example, their thoughts on opposing systemic racism, on LGBTQ discrimination, misogyny. How would you contribute? And in her, of course, book on the diversity delusion, you have some of that being expressed as well. So whether you look at her book on When Race Trumps Merit, or the diversity delusion, or one that we've talked about in the past, the war on cops, which I suspect she's going to come back to when we look at some of the things happening right there with ICE. And because of some of the work that she was doing in Los Angeles, we'll ask her about that when we connect up with her next hour. But I think it illustrates again that there are books and resources and articles coming out in the future that will address some of those issues as well. Just before I take a break, let me just mention that one of the biggest concerns right now in the Trump administration is the fact that they still cannot get their nominees through the United States Senate. Chuck Schumer, who is the leader of the minority, the Democrats in the U.S. Senate, have actually done all they can to prevent many of these nominees from being confirmed. And you might say, well, give me the numbers. Well, when I looked at it the other day, we had 86 of the Trump nominees that have been confirmed. So, okay, that's good. But we have 256 nominees that are pending in the Senate. Now, recognize some of the people that any president, whether it's Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, whatever, many of those nominees do not have to be confirmed in the Senate, but a significant number do, and we still have more than 250 that are just cooling their heels. And one of the ways in which presidents have been able to address that in the past is to say that when Congress is on recess, and if you noticed, it is right now, they could at least put those nominees in positions, and they would only be allowed to serve until the end of that congressional session, but it would at least be able to fill those positions. But back in the old days, Harry Reid actually created a situation which he argued that the Senate is never in recess, so you can never use a recess appointment. I think it's about time to change some of those rules and come back to what has always been used as a way to fill some of these very important positions, because what we're talking about is not one U.S. attorney has been confirmed, at least as of the other day when I checked it. So there's a lot more that needs to take place. Just before I take a break, though, let me mention that we do have our $10 campaign, and if you have not taken the time to visit the website or even perhaps respond to the email, let me encourage you to do that during the break. When we come back, we're going to be talking with our good friend, Colonel Alan West. Then later on, we'll do our best to connect up with Heather McDonald. But let's take a break, and you can find many of the articles we've been quoting from today on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
You already know that Point of View relies on people like you, listeners, to stay on the air. And here's something that you might not know. Only 1% of Point of View's listening audience currently gives. You heard that right, just 1%. But we've done the math, and if every listener, including you, gave just $10, that would be enough to fund Point of View for an entire year. So here is my challenge to you. If you have never given before, please spare $10 to help keep truth on the air. Your support will fund the daily broadcast as well as additional resources that equip listeners to apply God's truth in their own lives. In short, Americans need Point of View, and we need you. Give your $10 online at pointofview.net. Or you can give by calling toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800 347 5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to be spending some time in just a few minutes talking with Colonel Alan West. But just before we do so, let me just mention a couple other issues. I like to kind of take some of these short comments just to let you know that it's something we are watching and will pay attention to. And one of those, interestingly enough, is the whole question of energy and especially electricity. Now, I am broadcasting today from the state of Texas. About 2 weeks ago, we were in Alaska, but in Texas and some places around the country, California is another one, there have been some concerns from time to time about the electric grid. That is, fortunately, has not been a very hot summer in Texas, so the concerns about whether or not to shut down certain industries or certain parts or even allow for a blackout or a brownout to take place, really not the issue. But if you look down the road, that is of real concern. And there's a couple of issues that are related to that. The first is that right now there have been some people that have been very critical of the Republican budget bill, oftentimes referred to as the Big Beautiful Bill, because it's been phasing out some of the subsidies that were implemented by President Joe Biden. Now, that came under what was called the Inflation Reduction Act, but realistically, he admitted later on that that was basically the Green New Deal, and it was called the Inflation Reduction Act because it was trying to argue that it was going to help inflation. If anything, it probably made it worse. But that's not the point. The point is that particular bill and previous ones have been used to really focus a lot more national attention on wind and solar. And by providing very generous subsidies of wind and solar, it really distorted the costs. So as a result, if you're in the business of producing energy, electricity, all of a sudden you saw that some of these companies found that it was much more profitable to build these alternative sources of energy rather than to begin to build or refurbish or refit some of these gas plants. And so as a result, we've got a couple of things happening simultaneously. First of all, some of the various plants that exist right now are eventually going to go offline. That because they eventually have worn themselves out, or there's been a need to build new ones, or to maybe improve them with new technologies. And so the estimate that comes from the Energy Department is that by 2030, which is less than 5 years away, you are going to have a gap of 104 gigawatts of base load power. And so the first issue is that we aren't refurbishing the existing ways in which we're producing electricity fast enough. And so you think about it like a conveyor belt. Some of them are dropping off one end, and we're not putting new ones on the conveyor belt. And so as a result, we've got one issue that just simply comes because many of these energy companies and electricity companies spent more money and time and resources on alternative sources of power. And number two, they weren't doing what they needed to do with the existing sources of power. So you've got this gap of 104 gigawatts of electricity, of baseload power. But there's a second issue. And if you've been listening to Point of View any length of time, you know the other issue is AI. These AI data centers use a lot of energy. They use a lot of electricity. They gobble up enormous amounts of energy and electricity. Might also mention, to cool them down, they also gobble up a fair amount of water. That's another issue people are starting to talk about as well. I want to get into the argument as to whether or not maybe in a few places they were trying to seed clouds, which is why we've had some of this bizarre weather, but we'll leave that for another day. But you can begin to see that here is the problem. We aren't doing what we can to even maintain the base load that we have right now, because some of these are eventually going to go offline and we're not creating new ones. And instead, what we've been doing is creating very substantial and generous subsidies for wind and solar. As much as I appreciate the alternative sources of power, and oftentimes on my phone it will even tell me at night that it's recharging that from alternative sources of power that had been in batteries and charging it up, there are a couple of issues. Number one, even in the state of Texas where we broadcast, the wind doesn't always blow. So sometimes the wind turbines aren't all that effective. Number two, the sun doesn't always shine. And so we are dealing with some really significant issues. And finally, I just thought I'd pick out the fact that we have been told that by having these alternative sources of power, it would actually reduce costs. Well, I can tell you as a person that pays them, no, that's not the case. If nothing else, we've seen residential power prices rise rather dramatically, and that, I think, illustrates again some of the concerns. The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, and the costs actually that are supposed to be passed on to us because of these generous subsidies didn't quite turn out. So, not saying that we're going to have a problem with the electric grid right at the moment, but for people that are looking down the road, we are dealing with some very significant issues. And so it's one of those topics that we are going to address. I might just mention that we have produced a booklet on that, but probably the best way to cover some of this is to recognize that one of the best experts we've ever brought on the program to talk about the energy grid is Dr. Merrill Matthews, and he will be with us tomorrow, so we'll get into some of that as well. And he's one of those individuals who's done some of these calculations, who has actually been concerned about the fact that when we say we want to have all these solar panels, he started running the numbers on how many solar panels you would have to have and how much land would have to be dedicated to solar panels to even come close to something that rivals what is actually developed in these coal-fired plants, these natural gas plants, whatever it might be. And that, I think, illustrates again that as much as we may appreciate alternative sources of power, it still represents a very small percentage. And as a result, it's not as dependable because, as I just said, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. And yet President Biden, because of the Green New Deal, under the title of the Inflation Reduction Act, actually made it even more profitable to produce alternative sources of power instead of those which provide the base load power that you take for granted. We're so used to just walking into a room, flipping on the light switch, and the light goes on. We are amazed that every once in a while the lights go out. We have a blackout or a brownout, and yet that may be something that happens more in the future. And, of course, the other aspect of that is, before we head down this road too far with artificial intelligence, we need to really begin to ask some fundamental questions about those data centers as well, because they use a lot of electricity, and now we're starting to find out they also use a lot of water. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A recent poll by the Pew Research Center discovered that 27% of Americans view evangelicals as the most unfavorable faith. They also discovered that Jews ranked as the most favorable religious group. Now, the poll asked Americans to rank 6 of the mainstream religious groups. Those were Jews, mainline Protestants, Catholics, Muslims, Mormons, and evangelical Christians. The greatest number of unfavorable feelings were expressed towards evangelical Christians and Mormons. By contrast, the most positive feelings were reserved for Jews at 35%. In fact, only 6% said they had a negative view of them. Catholics came in at second at 34%, saying they viewed them favorably, and only 18% said they had a negative impression of them. I would contend that the poll not only tells us something about the people's attitudes towards various religious groups, but it also reminds us of the nature of those groups. On my radio program, I mentioned that a majority of Supreme Court justices are Catholic, as are a sizable number of members of Congress. Then I asked, what does that tell you about their politics? Of course, the answer is it doesn't tell you anything, because some take their Catholic faith seriously, while others do not. You could do the same by providing a list of prominent Jewish people. The religious groups with the highest favorability, Jews and Catholics, also have the greatest theological diversity. Often the religious label says less about their faith and more about their family background. The groups with the highest unfavorability, Mormons and evangelical Christians, have the greatest theological cohesion. Put another way, many Americans have no problem with religion unless the religious people take his or her faith very seriously. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you go to our website, you'll notice our third article is one written by Alan West, in which he talks about the fact that we need to encourage people to keep their oath, and we need to call out people that are breaking their oath. He starts by talking about the fact that he remembers with real pride on the 31st of July, 1982, when he took the oath of office to become a commissioned officer in the United States Army. Of course, as you well know, he's not only served 22 years in the U.S. Army, but also served as a member of Congress out of Florida's 22nd District. But he does point out that there are individuals in our nation who take an oath but bring dishonor, shame, and even a violation of that sacred bond upon themselves. And so one of the things that they have begun to do, and he's working with the American Constitutional Rights Union, is to begin to call out individuals who actually have broken their oath of office. And he points out that we are dealing with, and the numbers he uses seem to be pretty close to the fact that there may be over 600,000 criminal illegal immigrants that are freely roaming the United States. Now, you do see that in the Constitution, in Article 4, that the federal government is to provide protection from invasion. Now, they anticipated invasion from a foreign entity, but some people have said all these individuals represent an invasion. And the argument that he has made is that whether you look at President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, or the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, they did not follow their oath of office. And so as a result, that was a real concern. Now, it gets worse because those individuals will never really be called out for their irresponsibility. But he then points out that one of the reasons the American Constitutional Rights Union has actually developed what is called the Defender Initiative is because they've seen that the ACLU and other groups have been issuing threats and even filing lawsuits against law enforcement officials, in particular, oftentimes sheriffs in local communities, because those are sheriffs who've actually been coordinating with and working with ICE. And of course, as we started the program today, we talked about how people argued that ICE is Gestapo. And so as a result, what they want to do is defend anybody who decides, I think, and actually is following his or her oath of office to actually cooperate with the federal government and Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement under their 287G program. And as a result, to deal with this issue, because we have a considerable issue. So in this article that you can read at your leisure, he begins to call out certain people, attorney generals and attorneys in Fairfax County and police chiefs and the mayor of Massachusetts, in Boston, Massachusetts, Prince George, Maryland County, Washington State, Colorado. He gives you a pretty good list of individuals who are basically qualifying under what you might call being the oath breakers. And so in some respects, that is the case. I was hoping we would connect up with him, but I suspect he would also have a few things to say about those who took the oath of office to actually serve in the Texas legislature, but decided instead to run off to Illinois, New York, Massachusetts, wherever they might have landed, and to then say, we're fighting for you while we're fleeing the state. And I don't know how that's going to work in the minds of individuals. But one of the examples I was going to bring up to him is that, as we'll talk about in the last half hour, if we have some time after we've talked with Heather McDonald, or else we'll postpone it to another day, we're going to talk about socialism. And if you haven't been paying attention, what is so intriguing is that we've had a number of Marxists and socialists that gathered in Mexico City. I remember a couple of weeks ago, we had Dr. Merrill Matthews here, and he talked about the Socialist Conference in the United States, and then reminded us that we have some others coming up. And one of those was in the city of Mexico City. Now, what's so intriguing about that is during the opening ceremony, one of these representatives from, again, the state of Illinois, Delia Ramirez, she is married to an illegal alien, and she declared in Spanish, "I'm a proud Guatemalan before I am an American." Now, what I thought was so interesting is there's been a debate about the way in which she said it in Spanish. There would have been an easier way to have made it so it's a little bit obscure, but most people think that what she was simply saying is, I'm a Guatemalan first and I'm American second. If you accept that interpretation of her Spanish, and I don't claim to be able to exegete Spanish very well, but nevertheless, then you've got to remember that she took an oath of office as a member of Congress to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and it actually makes it very clear that their loyalty, when they raised their right hand, is indeed their loyalty is to the United States and not to any other country. And if indeed you accept that, then of course she has violated her own oath of office. So nevertheless, we wanted you, since we won't have a chance to talk with Colonel Allen West, Haven't been very good at getting anybody on the program with me today, but that's okay. We will continue on and mention that his article is there. You can read it for yourself and maybe even contact him if you'd like more information. But just before we take a break, one of the other things we encourage you to do is to recognize that sometimes the way in which the media will try to inject some kind of bias is by deflection. And right now, there is an attempt to say that certain things are a distraction so that the mainstream media doesn't have to talk about it. And Tim Graham, who is an individual who's been on the program with us many times before with Newsbusters, said, there's something funny in scandal politics when people accuse each other of pushing a distraction. So if Donald Trump tries to change the subject to the Russia collusion hoaxing, well, that's a distraction from the media's obsession of Jeffrey Epstein. And he says all this really proves is the liberal media elites get unhappy whenever anyone tries to offer a different topic than the one that they demand that we be magnetically focused on. He says the networks don't want any contrary new information added to their narrative of how Trump won in 2016 with Russian assistance. But of course, as we've pointed out, that was not the case. Their framing, he says, is presented as the only acceptable framing, the one based on reality. The public is always supposed to be focused on Republican scandals. They're the only ones that matter. Democratic scandals are reflexively dismissed as no evidence, nothing burgers, or unsubstantiated junk. And he says this is transparently a partisan news judgment. He says it gives you the same giggle, he says, when reporters complain that this Russia thing is an 8-year-old story as they push new material on Trump's alleged birthday card to Epstein in 2003. By the way, I think that's not the case, but nevertheless, or that they push the unproven allegations from Jean Carroll of Trump sexually assaulting her inside a department store, which happened sometime in the 1990s. Those are not old stories. Those are ones that need to be pushed to the forefront. Which year, who needs to know, just slamp Trump with some vague civil charges of being liable for sexual abuse and move on. And so he says maybe we should suggest that this whole Trump and Epstein scandal is a distraction from the much more intricate friendship and Epstein Island touring of, are you ready for this, former President Bill Clinton. While the networks dump coverage on Trump and Epstein, a search of Nexus transcripts of CBS News in last month found the only 4 cursory mentions of Clinton. And of course, that, in some respects, is the bigger story, but it's not the one that is necessarily being brought to the fore. So again, as we'll talk about this next half hour with Heather McDonald, sometimes the way in which you get media bias is not by what you say, but what you don't cover. But another aspect of that is when you describe a particular relevant story as a distraction, that allows you to bring it back to your story that you want focused and to ignore another story, even if there's new information come from some of those burn bags that were found in that annex, that so-called annex or that secret room there in the FBI headquarters. Come back, though. I believe we will be talking with Heather McDonald. Her book is entitled When Race Trumps Merit. We'll get into the issue of DEI and some of the reporting of ICE, and that will be some of the things we'll cover with her. And again, if you are looking for some of the articles we've been mentioning, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us today Heather McDonald, and again, she is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. The book that we are talking about and have focused on, When Race Trumps Merit, How the Pursuit of Equity Sacrifices Excellence, Destroys Beauty, and Threatens Lives. But I might mention some of her other books in the past, The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. Of course, the book War on Cops. And recently we even quoted from her piece in the Wall Street Journal, Is Rioting Acceptable? If so, how much? We'll get to that in just a minute. But Heather, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby. I appreciate being with you.
Even though we broadcast across the country, I do want to talk about something that's happening just down the road. And 2 days ago in Fort Worth, there was a debate, and it went on for hours and hours and hours about DEI, the very topic in your book. And it had to do with the fact that the mayor, Maddie Parker, said we have to close down these DEI programs and offices. Otherwise, we face the loss of $277 million of federal grants. It's actually worse than that because they received some of that money, so they'd have to give it back. And you would think that that alone, and then the fact that if individuals still stay there, they might even be prosecuted by the Justice Department. So you would think that would be very easy, and you would be wrong, because for hour after hour after hour after hour, people were making arguments that if we lose these DEI programs or these offices, it's going to go take us back to segregation, to Jim Crow. And even with the threat of losing $277 million, there were just an enormous number of people shouting and screaming until 11:30 at night, in which they finally closed it down and voted to close those down. So it illustrates to me that DEI is still out there and being supported by a very vocal minority of individuals.
Well, that's exactly the question, Kerby, is what effect is the Trump pushback against the tyranny of race grifting, of double standards? Is it going to have a long-term effect? And can those people who believe that race and sex are qualifications in themselves simply dig in and hold out? And I don't have an answer to that, but it is certainly one of the major questions of our time. I have to tell you, Kerby, I get just exhausted by the response, the demand to lower standards on behalf of this or that group. My response is meet the standards. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a pretty much too much of a vague term. It covers too many things. The core of the matter that this battle is being fought over, Kerby, is racial preferences. Do you have two sets of standards, a lower set of standards to hire blacks and other so-called underrepresented minorities, or do you hold everybody to the same standard? And the demand again and again is we want to be let in under a different lower set of standards. We've seen this in teacher licensing exam, in police qualification exam, in medical licensing exams, in qualifications required to get into medical school, to practice medicine, to become a hospital doctor. The demand is always lower standards on our behalf. It gets very wearisome. The better strategy would be, no, we will not only meet your damn standards, we're going to best them. That's what Jews did when they were facing actual anti-Semitism, when they were being excluded from law firms and from banks because they were not seen as clubbable. They became so good. They became so good as lawyers. They became so good as investment bankers that the WASP institutions couldn't not hire them because they would not be competitive. That's what blacks should be doing instead of saying we need an endless series of accommodations and lowered standards. Now, the response that you adumbrate there, Kerby, which is, well, we're going to face Jim Crow and we're still facing a discriminatory environment, so we need to have an explicit policy and quotas and set-asides. I'm sorry, that is simply ludicrous. We were a racist society. We were a white supremacist society. We treated blacks for centuries, for decades in this century, with gratuitous cruelty and nastiness. That is a fact. It's a historical fact, but it is not the reality of our world world today, there's not a single mainstream institution in the media, in corporate world, in academia, in philanthropy, in banking, that isn't twisting itself into knots to hire and promote as many blacks as possible. The reality of our world today, Kerby, is black privilege, not white privilege. I'll believe in white privilege when I hear about a black high school senior who puts his race down on his college application form as white because he thinks that's going to confer an advantage on him. The reality is the opposite. There are thousands of white males who are wondering if they can possibly get away with putting themselves down as black, because that will afford them a six-fold advantage in some cases in college admissions.
Again, this is part of the book, When Race Trumps Merit. And again, that book is on our website in case you couldn't find it in your local bookstore. I thought, Tether, I'd talk about one other aspect, because obviously lowered standards, and that surprised me because at least two of my degrees are in the science area, and I never thought that DEI would make its way into woke science, but it did. But it's worse than that, because in one of your other books, I guess Diversity Delusion, you talked about the fact that even in the applications to medical school, this comes from the nonprofit Do No Harm, they're asking about whether or not you've committed yourself to equity and inclusion, and really even dealing with systemic racism and the rest. There have been some various individuals at the NIH have said we really want to fund researchers who have been homeless and foster care. And that's the other thing that came out the other night. What are we doing for the marginalized people? Well, let's help the marginalized people with a hand up, but not a hand out. Let's encourage them to work harder, but there seems to be almost not only lowering the standards, but even going out of our way to bring in people in the areas of science and medicine that probably aren't as qualified because they check the right boxes in terms of DEI.
Well, this is a central component of When Race Trumps Merit, which is the attack on scientific standards in medicine and in the hard sciences. It's everywhere, and the medical schools have really dug in their heels. They have not moved to a single standard of admissions to medical schools, and we have yet to put the grading system back in the medical licensing exam that was removed and replaced with pass-fail because grades had a disparate impact on black medical students in trying to get hospital residencies. So it is amazing, but it's been going on for a long time. People, to be honest, Kerby, were sort of shutting their eyes to it. There's been, for a very long time, to be hired as a scientist in an American university, you had to sign a loyalty oath to diversity, which meant that you were going to lower standards in your lab for hiring lab assistants and fellow scientists, that you were going to lower standards in your grading for so-called underrepresented students. And we have to believe that there's no such thing as merit, that there's no such thing in a range of abilities. That's simply another fiction. Of course there are. There is no way that I have any possibility of getting through a PhD in physics. I simply do not have the math skills, and becoming a doctor requires an enormous amount of quantitative thinking, of the ability to absorb a constantly changing information landscape, and use the facts that you know in a very sophisticated cognitive way to make diagnoses. Of course, there are differences in ability, and for us to pretend that doesn't matter, whether it's in a field that is not a life and death field, like classical music, symphony orchestra choices, art museums, corporate executives. I mean, there's not life and death there, but there is still skill. But certainly in fields like engineering, medicine, biology, it matters what you know and what you can do. And the tests that we have for evaluating skill, for evaluating knowledge, are not racist. They are not biased. The standardized tests like the SATs or the LSATs to get into law school, the MCATs to get into medical school. They have been examined with microscopes for the last several decades to find any hint of bias, any question that has particularly divergence on race that blacks are doing particularly poorly at, we throw out. These are legitimate tests.
Let's take a break, and we'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Heather McDonald. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Heather McDonald as we talk about this book on race trumps merit, how the pursuit of equity sacrifices excellence, destroys beauty, and threatens lives. Might just mention the first part deals with science and medicine, which we've talked about, and I've done numerous columns based on her book in that regard. We just mentioned in passing, of course, the whole issue of the arts, a whole section here about culture and the arts and classical music and all of the rest. And then a section at the end on law and order, which was very reminiscent of her book on the war on cops. But I thought for just a minute, we've been talking about a piece that you wrote back in June. Is rioting acceptable? If so, how much? I've done a commentary on it as well. And in part, it illustrates something that's concerned me, and that is you were out in Los Angeles trying to figure out what was happening in the area of law enforcement. And yet there were some incidents where they broke into ICE facilities, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and overpowered a skeleton crew of National Guard soldiers. You tell a story of 2 ICE agents overwhelmed by a dozen men, picked up one of the handcuffed suspects and run off. And at the end said there was no coverage at all by the press. And one of the articles, Heather, we started with today comes from the editors of National Review. ICE is no Gestapo, but I suspect that I'm going to see a lot more articles and maybe even a book on just the way in which law enforcement and in particular ICE agents are being treated here in the country and by the various people in our society. So if nothing else, I wanted to get your thoughts about that, because this issue of ICE agents and the way they're being doxxed and threatened is very concerning. We broadcast here in Texas, and right down the road is Alvarado, Texas, where he had 11 agitators opening fire on agents. And we're going to have Alan West on just to talk about, do we need rules of engagement for ICE agents? So what are your thoughts?
Well, it's no surprise. It's sad, but it's no surprise because we have the twin narratives about law enforcement being racist and then immigration enforcement being racist and illegitimate. There's this idea that once you cross into the country illegally, you're entitled to stay here, and any hint of deportation is completely unjustified. This is according to the advocates, and your government shouldn't even raise fear in illegal aliens that they may be deported. That's the theme of a lot of articles, is illegal aliens fearful, and that's really horrible. How dare the government make them fearful? They're not even being deported. They're just fearful of being deported. So it's an amazing entitlement. But the narrative against law enforcement is so sweeping that it's been open season on ICE. The attacks on ICE officers around Los Angeles are up 400% since Trump took office. And we've had attorney generals, we've had district attorneys in many more progressive left-wing jurisdictions that declared upon taking office, I'm thinking here of George Gascon, Los Angeles, or Alvin Bragg in New York, or Pamela Price in Alameda County, Oakland, California, that they would not even prosecute resisting arrest, which sends the message that it's okay to disobey a lawful order, and that the one side of the criminal justice system is not going to honor the other side of it. So this is a very dangerous situation to be in. You cannot allow the forces that are trying to preserve law and order, which is tenuous, it's fragile, we take it for granted. It is the primary obligation of government. Nothing else matters compared to its obligation to make sure that citizens can be safe in their persons and in their property, and I stress here property. We conservatives are too squeamish about asserting the importance of the protection of property to a civilized society. We need to be able to have respect for those forces and not delegitimate them with phony charges of racism or discrimination.
Let me just mention, too, if you want more information, of course, we have information about the book, but also Manhattan.Institute. But I thought, just to wind down, one of the things I always want to encourage our listeners is to be good consumers of news and information. And at a time when you have people saying, well, these were protests that were largely peaceful, you talk about a federal judge that said, well, these were just some stray violent incidences. You reminded us of a quote that I use quite often by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, defining deviancy down. We do seem to be defining riots down, and it seems to me that a good and wise and discerning consumer of news and information needs to recognize that we're not getting the whole story by the mainstream media.
Well, even if you are getting the whole story, you know, they every so often they couldn't help reporting on these burned cars, the concrete blocks and scooters being thrown off a freeway overpass on the 101 in downtown L.A. at the California Highway Patrol down below. So thank heavens for social media that gives us the video. But the issue is, as you say, Kerby, is the ideological and normative one of defining deviance down. We're supposed to believe that, well, if only 50 blocks in downtown Los Angeles are burning and have succumbed to the sources of chaos and anarchy, that's not a big deal. We shouldn't worry about it. My view is one burning car is too many. One looted store is too many.
Yes.
One attack on a police officer is too many. We should not accept any level of rioting and try to minimize it. Trump called in the National Guard simply to protect federal property and federal agents. He was not enforcing the law. It was not a constitutional violation, but he was perfectly entitled to do that because we cannot allow attacks on our law enforcement officers.
Well, again, let me just mention that the book is entitled Race Trumps Merit. Of course, I've mentioned some of the others, whether it is the diversity delusion, the war on cops, and, of course, some of the articles that we've posted by Heather McDonald. So thank you for giving us a little bit of time today here on Point of View. Thank you for what you write, and we look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kerby. Great talking to you.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, let me just mention that one of the things I want to encourage you to do is to be more discerning. As she points out, we're willing to say, oh, well, it's just a burned car here. It's just a piece of property there that was destroyed. And I just think it illustrates again that from a biblical point of view, we should say it's really Isaiah 5:20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. And so wanted you to hear a little bit more about that today. We, of course, talked about the piece on the Democratic Protectorate in Illinois, coming from the editors of the Wall Street Journal. ICE is no Gestapo, which comes from the editors of National Review. A piece by Alan West, of course, the book by Heather McDonald. And I did post 2 on socialism, but those will have to come to another day because of the way in which some things were rearranged. And so, again, I hope that you will join us tomorrow. It is our Friday weekend edition. We'll talk a little bit about, of course, the issue of what is happening in terms of gerrymandering, but we're going to move on to many other issues. Dr. Merrill Matthews has been kind of an expert on the issue of pharmaceutical drugs and what is happening there. We're going to talk a little bit about the tariffs. We'll get into that as well. We have the defunding of Planned Parenthood and then the attempt to bring it back through one rogue federal judge, but I think that one will be reversed very quickly. And also a piece on whether or not we are moving towards the genetic engineering of a new race. So it will be, I think, a very interesting 2 hours tomorrow here on Point of View. Don't forget, we, of course, have our $10 challenge for you. If you've not clicked on that button, I would encourage you to do so. My Viewpoints commentary today is about how evangelicals are oftentimes seen as the most unfavorable faith. So you can read all of that on our website at pointofview.net. I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition right here on Point of View.
You already know that Point of View relies on people like you, listeners, to stay on the air. And here's something that you might not know. Only 1% of Point of View's listening audience currently gives. You heard that right, just 1%. But we've done the math, and if every listener, including you, gave just $10, that would be enough to fund Point of View for an entire year. So here is my challenge to you. If you have never given before, please spare $10 to help keep truth on the air. Your support will fund the daily broadcast as well as additional resources that equip listeners to apply God's truth in their own lives. In short, Americans need Point of View, and we need you. Give your $10 online at pointofview.net. Or you can give by calling toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.